Thank you so much for that introduction. And what an honor it is to be here at a time when we're really trying to understand how we can best support democracy worldwide. So I'm very grateful to IDEA for inviting me, because I think that this is the moment where we need to collectively defend democracy. I want to lead you through a journey from our publication of the Limits to Growth in 1972 to our thinking in Earth for All, and then how we're actually implementing that thinking today and some of our thought process. And I say our because I actually have two of my, let's say, colleagues in crime, partners in crime, who are here today. Owen Gaffney, who is one of the co-authors of Earth for All, but also Anders Wijkman, who was absolutely integral in the thinking that went into both Earth for All and also the Club of Rome, as also an honorary president of the Club of Rome and such an important statesman in Sweden. If we look at this journey, we need to think about how is it that we are today where we are, and how do we move into creating a well-being on a finite planet? What does that look like if we take into consideration the history of the Limits to Growth, the 50 years of reflection, the understanding that already in 1972, the MIT scientists and economists that came together and undertook the system dynamic model that was actually being proposed by Donella Meadows, Dennis Meadows, Jürgen Randers, and William Behrens, working on the trends that were happening at the time and how they started to build scenarios into the future. And understanding that from 1972, if we continue to look at industrial output, we would start hitting the boundaries, the planetary boundaries that Johan Rockström talks about now today. That we would start to see that growth of population have such an impact in terms of the demand and the consumption of natural resources, and also a deep impact on the different types of productions that we would see, whether it be energy production or whether it be food production. And you can see that if we look at today, or 2025, although this was actually produced for 2024, you can see that already in 2024, some of those key impacts, those key tipping points would come together. Now, fast forward 50 years later, what we wanted to do with Earth for All was start to understand, taking the context of the Limits to Growth, what that means in the 21st century. Understanding that we actually were in the midst of the predictive tipping points that we see in those different scenarios of the Limits to Growth. Understanding that we'd lost 50 years. And that also there was the time and the possibility to change course, but that if we were going to do so, we were going to have to put forward some key pathways of change in order to enable us to do so. And what would that look like within a 21st century context? Now, Earth for All, A Survival Guide for Humanity was published actually as the anniversary seminal report of the Limits to Growth, not only in English, but translated now into 12 languages, including in Swedish. And what it shows is that it builds on the fact that those predictions in the Limits to Growth became a reality. That if you actually look at where we were in 1972 and all of the Earth systems trends and also the socioeconomic trends that we were going to continue, and we did, hit our continuous growth of carbon dioxide alongside population growth, but also NOx, also the relationship with GDP. And although real GDP growth continued to grow, we're now saying that actually real GDP growth is decreasing, not increasing. And that is because of those Earth system trends and socioeconomic trends that we are starting to see are having a real impact. And this is based on a series of what I call elephants in the room, because it's not only the fact that we've had deep impacts on an Earth system level and on a socioeconomic level. But we're also seeing the interrelationship between the wealthiest having the greatest impact on the planet. The fact that the share of global population by income, the top 1% or 10% within that share of population, is actually having the greatest amount of consumption-based CO2. And so the link between the wealthiest and actually the impact on our planetary boundaries is fundamental. But also the fact that then those that are the most vulnerable, the poorest in our society, are the ones that are having the greatest negative impact coming from climate change. So we must address consumption. This was one of the key messages in 1972, and yet a message that did not resonate during Reaganomics, during Thatcher, and all of the other neoliberal economies, and in particular leaderships that continued during the time until today. The other elephant in the room with regard to the rich is that actually the poorest 50% take less than the 15% in total earnings. So we're starting to see that within country wealth distribution has recently been moving in the wrong way. So what we're seeing is not only are the wealthiest having the greatest impact in terms of climate and also in terms of environmental impacts, but also we're seeing that the wealthiest are the ones that are holding on to the wealth, and inequality is growing at the same time. And so you can see in terms of the graph here that we are not enabling greater wealth distribution, not only, as we often say, between the global south and the global north, but also within the global north. Inequality and poverty has increased in the West. It has increased in the United States. It has increased in Europe. And it is also increased between the North and the South. But here's another elephant in the room, is that if we continue to only push productivity and GDP growth, as we have seen up until now, we will see a growing cost of inaction. It is what we call, of course, the fact that we have not taken into consideration either social or environmental externalities. But in particular, what we're seeing now is that even in terms of climate change and temperature increases, we can see now that at a 1.5 degree of global warming, and some of you may know that this year we have pretty much had an average of about 1.5 degrees, we will lose upwards of 3% of GDP. So no matter what we do, our GDP will get impacted by the fact that actually at 1.5 degrees, we are having direct impact on our soil impact with regard to food production. We're having direct impact on our economies, whether it be through weather events or whether it be through loss of potential of production because of climate impacts. In addition to that, we know that if we move towards a 3-degree world, we could have upwards of 10 to 12% of GDP loss. So with that elephant in the room comes a question. Why do we continue to depend on GDP? We know that the continuous impact of climate change, which is driven by overproduction, which is driven by natural resource loss, that actually will continue to drive a loss of GDP. Hence, we need to think through the types of models, economic models, that we are actually promoting today, shifting from a neoliberal consumption-based economic model, which was already put forward in the Limits to Growth as a model which would create these tipping points, into a model which enhances well-being. Because here is the last key elephant in the room. We have been sold a lie. Over the last 50 years, we have been told through neoliberal economic thought that actually trickle down will work. That actually wealth distribution will happen automatically when people and economies get wealthier. That actually we will have GDP growth, and therefore that will enable our people to live better lives and livelihoods. But what we've seen through our analysis, through the Earth for All system dynamic model, which I'm going to lead you through, is that global well-being is declining. That with GDP growth plus population growth plus climate change, we're actually moving into negative well-being and high social tension. And take into consideration these two elements as being absolutely essential to enable thriving democracies. Because we know that when we lose global well-being, we know that when we have higher social tension, we know that we can shift much more into autocracies. And we're seeing this development in many countries. Hello. Now, importantly, this is also coming out of new surveys that we have undertaken across the G20 countries, and which I will also lead you through, where we have stress tested this thinking. And we have seen that actually citizens, and 69% of G20 citizens, want a well-being economy. They're not happy with the current neoliberal model. And you can see it in our assessment, which is very clear that therefore we need to try to find a balance between average well-being growing up and social tension going down. That is why our assessment, as we shifted from the limits to gross thinking into our new analysis around creating an Earth for all, was very much anchored in shifting beyond GDP. Because that shift beyond GDP is very much anchored in 5 key principles. The first is taking into account social and environmental risk in financial and economic decision making. It's fundamentally getting back to what is most important for people and costing externalities, both environmental externalities and social externalities. The second is to correct the inequity between high and low income countries, to ensure that actually we move away from this international finance and trade system, which is actually enhancing that inequity, and move into a system which starts to enable the global south to actually thrive, not just survive, taking into consideration trade deficits, taking into consideration debt cancellation. But it also means that we have to have a very different type of perspective of public goods to socialize the rewards of environmental and social commons, and then to increase the agency of women and workers to drive the direction of the economy, something that we actually saw during COVID, that transformation during COVID where we saw social workers as a fundamental part of our economy, or the fact that in Africa, for example, most of the farmers are actually women, but they're not included into the economy. It's still a parallel economy. Or how can we ensure that we have more women enabled by getting the education that they deserve, which then enables them to make decisions around how they actually integrate into the economy. And then the last key point, as I indicated, which was that elephant in the room of we know that we will, no matter what now, as we already are at 1.5, lose GDP growth. Hence, we need to buffer our GDP with new indicators that take into consideration nature, environment, and social well-being. There are a variety of different types of economies that are looking, or economic models, that are looking at these 5 core aspects of the economy. The well-being economic model, which is the one that we very much tried to integrate into our thinking of Earth for All. But also, if you look at Mariana Mazzucato's work, very much focused on mission economies that are driving a move towards environmental and social economic well-being. Or green growth, or post-growth, donut economics, which has been put forward by Kate Rayworth and is being adopted and adapted to local communities. and the discussion around beyond GDP. Beyond GDP, which is now actually, even at the UN level, being part of a new high-level group of experts who are thinking through what are these new indicators. All of these have very different facets of what I'm speaking about. And I think the beauty of the work that we tried to undertake in Earth for All was coming together in an understanding that it is a variety of different types of economies, as long as they take into consideration these 5 core principles, are fundamental in terms of moving us forward from the current neoliberal economic way of life. A neoliberal economic way of life which actually has created the climate change aspects that we're seeing in our everyday life, that has created all of the different impacts that we're seeing today, and also that has created greater inequality and greater poverty. So we have shifted from the limits to growth in 1972, but anchored that thinking into the 21st century by building in an understanding of the planetary boundaries and trying to fit within that operating space of addressing social and environmental equity at the same time. We produced Earth for All in 2022. It was a publication, but it was meant from the outset to be more than just a publication. It needed to be anchored, and this is all the incredible work that Owen Gaffney very much worked with us on and wanted to ensure that we were in the creation of new narratives, the creation of proper storytelling, understanding through the lives of 4 women what this could mean across the globe. And you will see if you read the book that this is part of what we wanted to do, shifting from the scientific and the economic analysis into what does this mean for people. But it was also very important for us to then anchor it into the SDGs, to understand what are the links then with what the international community is thinking, and also in particular those countries that have anchored their policy into the Sustainable Development Goals, and to link our scenarios and our thinking to what that would mean if we applied the SDGs. A systems change agenda for well-being within the planetary boundaries is the final thinking that came out of all of this analysis, bringing together transformational economics for well-being with global and regional system modeling. We did this collectively, working together, the Club of Rome, the Norwegian Business School, the Stockholm Resilience Center, and the Potsdam Institute. And what we came to through all of our analysis and the system dynamic modeling is the fact that if we truly wanted to reach a well-being state, a global state of economic well-being, we would need to actually put in place collectively 5 key turnarounds. And I'm going to lead you through some of this thinking. A reduction of poverty, an empowerment of women and workers, ensuring that inequality decreases across the globe between North and South, but also within country, and then a transformation of our food and energy system. And this is just one of the spaghetti plots, what we call the interrelationships within that system dynamic model. And you can see that we can look at population growth and the relationship between births and deaths and GDP per person and life expectancy, total fertility, and all of the interrelationships that might lead us to public spending per person or social trust, or the links with greenhouse gas emissions and global warming, and everything in between. But I think the core aha moment for the entire team, and in particular for climate scientists like Johan Rockström, was this one: that the speed of action on planetary boundaries is a function of the speed of action on inequality and poverty. And that if we are going to move forward in trying to attain net zero or zero carbon, we also have to think about zero poverty. We have to think about zero inequality. We have to think about the interrelationships between both. The approach and the method that we tried to incorporate into our thinking was around the evaluation of a large number of scientific studies, to survey a large number of experts, not only during the system dynamic model, but also in terms of our what we call our Transformational Economics Commission, bringing in economists from across the globe, not just Western economists, because we realize that actually the largest body of shift in economic thought was predominantly in the West. Stress testing this with experts on the ground, ensuring that we actually had also a series of other papers, deep dive papers that would go into some of the granularity of our findings. Bringing in now a variety of different system dynamic models, because as always, you have to actually look at the granularity of all these different models. You have to think about what do you do then at the national level. This was a global model at the beginning, and we wanted to ensure that we can then apply this model at the national level, at the regional level, and even get even more granular at the city level, including social, economic, and environmental indicators across the board, ensuring that we actually had verifiable interactions between indicators, and then very much focusing on a continuation of our thinking, which was two key scenarios. The too little too late scenario, which is today's scenario, and the giant leap scenario, which is what we call our alternative future, an alternative future that gives us hope towards a well-being economy, and a reflection of these results in very detailed long-term analysis and scenarios. When we look at these two scenarios, very important point to take into account, that actually the loss, potential loss in GDP, or the potential cost of GDP, would be about 2 to 4%. So 2 to 4% of global income would be needed to invest in a better future, in that giant leap scenario. A scenario where societies are more resilient, where extreme weather events are decreasing, and where we're actually not getting into a total toppling of our economies. This builds resilience in our economies, just 2 to 4%. This is about the amount. Actually, I would even say it's less than what we are spending on defense. But obviously, that is another conversation that we might want to have during the panel. The too little too late scenario, let me be very clear, is today's scenario, or I would say a 2022 scenario, because I think actually today's scenario would probably be worse than the too little too late scenario, simply because of the backtracking that we're now seeing in the United States, and that potentially the ricochet effect that we could see outside of the United States. If we look at the adoption, that was already in there. If we look at those 5 key turnarounds in detail, which then enable us to get to that well-being economy, what we wanted to do was unpack each of these turnarounds with some core policy proposals. If we were to end poverty and allow low to middle income countries to reach a minimum income threshold of about $15,000 per person per year, we would need to then look at the International Monetary Fund and look at the way in which we are putting forward special drawing rights. We would have to address canceling debt, because for the moment, we know very clearly that actually there is no fiscal space within the global south, because they are asphyxiated by debt and cannot actually have the proper budgetary possibilities to allocate this towards a proper just transition. That we would need to work in terms of south to south trade, but also north and south trade in terms of removing obstacles to technology transfer, intellectual property constraints, etc. On addressing inequality, this would mean that the wealthiest 10% would take no more than 40% of national incomes. Because what we noticed was actually that 10% currently takes up to 60 to 80% of national incomes, depending on which country we're speaking about. And that this very much would entail taxing the wealthiest. Some of you may be familiar with the work that we've been doing with the Patriotic Millionaires and Oxfam. A great deal of push now also at the OECD level and the G20 level. Very clear that what we came out with in 2022 is now part of the discourse of the necessity of creating greater budgets for ensuring that we reduce inequality through the taxation of the super rich. but also legislating and strengthening workers' rights in order to enable the deeper transformation and the link between workers and the economy, as today we are in an over-financialized economy, an economy which is predominantly dominated by shareholder value rather than by labor and workers. And then introducing citizen funds to give all citizens their fair share of a national income, wealth, and the global commons through a fee and dividend scheme. In terms of accelerating gender equality, to improve well-being and to really ensure that we stabilize population growth, this means providing access to education for all girls and women, achieving gender equity in jobs and leadership, and providing adequate pensions. So this is not just about having a quota. This is about ensuring that girls and women are part of the economy and are properly given access to education across the globe. We would need to transform the food system and transform the energy system. And again, when you look at these, this is not brain science. Most of us have been saying very similar types of policy action is necessary. But what's important here is that while we look at a regenerative food system and providing healthy diets for people, while we look at a carbon law pathway where we're actually reducing greenhouse gases by 50% every decade, we are taking into consideration the empowerment of women, inequality, and poverty. That is the difference with regard to the scenarios that we are trying to show within Earth for All. And then what happens? The proof is in the pudding. A world with less inequality is clearly apparent with the giant leap scenario. The giant leap scenario that takes into consideration those 5 core turnarounds and the policy proposals that I've shown just now. It means that actually, if you look at our Earth for All Inequality Index, that already if we start to apply those 5 key turnarounds, in 2040, we're seeing a net difference in terms of inequality between the giant leap and the too little too late scenario. It also means in terms of global poverty that actually we're seeing a net difference already starting in 2030 and then in 2040 about the same proportion of 1/4 of a reduction in poverty as we also see in inequality. So this is quite fast. These turnarounds, if we put them together, if we put in place these policy recommendations, already start to see an acceleration in human development in low-income countries. Because we're also reforming the system, not only in terms of our domestic tax laws, but we're also working at the international level through the international financial and the trade system. And I think what's fundamental here is that people understand that critical feedback loop between the action on the planetary boundaries being a function of action on inequality and poverty. The critical feedback loop, which most of us have seen unfold in front of our eyes, whether it be in terms of the US elections or whether it be here in terms of the farmers' riots, in terms of the pushback that we have received at many different levels across our countries as we were moving into the European elections. The fact that people are angry, that the level of social tension has increased because the quality of life of most people, the majority, has gone down. That we have not taken into consideration that because of our over-financialized economy, people's lives and livelihoods are not being serviced. And that plus the compound effect of the pandemic, the compound effect of climate change, has made people's lives and also their anxiety go up. So we need to take into consideration social trust. If we look now at democracy, at the principles of democracy, at upholding democracy, we need to take into consideration what people are feeling and how they're starting to push back against what we would think would be democratic principles in some ways, and electing governments that are actually bringing in principles of fear, principles of loss, principles of increased anxiety. All of these need to be taken into consideration as we move forward in trying to support democracy worldwide. Taking into consideration also the role of the state. The role of the state for whom? For what? intervening to reduce inequality, but also planetary breakdown, protecting the weakest link, not just the wealthiest. If we look at the greatest transformation that most of us have ever seen during COVID, in many cases, those economies that were the strongest, the most performing during COVID were those that actually protected everyone, ensured that they communicated properly to everyone, that everyone's life mattered, not just the small minority of wealthiest. So it is very important to take into consideration this critical feedback loop when thinking through the elements that are also important for democracy. Because we know that inequality reduces trust. And if we look at what's happened in the United States, wage inequality in the US has increased by 14% between 1970 and 2010. But since 1978, and I use this statistic all the time because I'm gobsmacked, the fact that US CEO salaries have increased by 1,460% since 1978. Employee salaries only by 18%. And this is starting to encroach on other parts of the world as there is a competition between CEO packages. Well, as we look at the earnings in the hands of just a few, we can see that US citizens, their level of trust has decreased. And in particular, interestingly enough, their level of trust has decreased in terms of government as well as business. So gone is the economy where most people think we have one around organization, around production, consumption, and exchange. It's very clear that we have an overly monetized economy, a transactional economy, where money is made on money and the shifting value of various assets from stocks and bonds to real estate, to intellectual property, and to crypto. I mean, we're now hearing that actually the US dollar could collapse because of new cryptocurrencies that are being introduced by our own US president. That manipulation of these financial assets now dominates economic decision-making across the globe. That is what we state in Earth for All. And we talk about the fact that we need to redraw the game board. We need to get away from this over-financialized economy, from this over-monetized economy, transactional economy, by starting to look at the possibility of setting up citizen funds, by ensuring that we actually tax wealth, that we reallocate government measures. We get rid of the perversities in our market. We are subsidizing fossil energy. We are subsidizing industrial agriculture. We are subsidizing everything which is actually currently detrimental to our life's blood, whether it be nature or whether it be our own economies. We have to reform the international financial system, and we need to address new progress indicators in the context of well-being economies. This is an interesting point where we now see that the work that we have done on ensuring that we have new indicators and we move beyond GDP is actually growing also in terms of the way in which the European Commission and institutions are looking at the economy and new indicators. The way in which the UN has integrated new indicators into their thinking with regard to setting up a new expert group. And the way in which we see the new economies across the globe, what we call the well-being economies, that actually have gone beyond GDP and put in place indicators which are environmentally focused and socially focused alongside a buffer of GDP growth. What we've been able to do through this thinking is reduce emissions with our giant leap. And we've been able, by looking at some of this shift from rentierism into showing that we actually can achieve well-being for all within the giant leap, that this will also reduce social tension. By putting in place those 5 key turnarounds and ensuring that we have that core feedback loop. What's important is the core theory of change here. The fact that we can influence a significant number of governments by having the right key conversations. What we wanted to do was to work with specific multilaterals to ensure that we change the narrative, that we embark on a new type of storytelling, policy, media, and public debate, that we deliver national engagement strategies by using our Earth for All modeling. We have done that now in Germany, in Austria, in Kenya. We're looking at Australia and Brazil in terms of introducing new national programs that are built on Earth for All thinking. But that all of this is anchored in scientific evidence, modeling, and simulator work. This is important at a time when we know that science-based decision-making is getting a great deal of pushback. That we're also trying to instigate a global conversation and open up a public campaign. Through our work, we have built a movement, and we're trying to work with a series of different partners all over the globe, in ensuring that actually Earth for All is not just a book, but is translated into new school programs, is translated into discussions in book clubs, is translated into potential citizen assemblies, and also is translated into policy at different levels from international all the way down to local. Now let me quickly go through the 2024 survey that we undertook in order to stress test some of our thinking and to see if what we were seeing through Earth for All matched citizen opinion. We asked people across 18 G20 countries and 4 additional countries their opinions on political and economic issues and policy proposals. And we saw that 81% say democracy is a good way of governing their country. So that's important. But only 40% believe that having a strong leader who doesn't bother with parliament and election is too. So we actually have a proportion who still believe that actually a strong leader is also important. And this we're seeing mapping out in a variety of different countries now across the globe. 39% believe their government can be trusted to make decisions for the benefit of the majority. So trust has actually reduced or gone down in terms of government. Trust in government tends to be the lowest in European countries among older people and those dissatisfied with their household financial situation. There is a majority of support among those surveyed in the G20 for reform of national and global political and economic systems, with slightly more support for reform at the national level. So although there is support for reform, we're also seeing some contradictions in terms of the belief in governments to be able to do what they need to do. 69% of people are aware that we are reaching tipping points. So it is clear that across the G20, citizens understand that the Earth is close to climate and nature tipping points due to human activities. And most people know we need action now. 71% of people believe that the world needs to take immediate action within the next decade to reduce carbon emissions. What was interesting is that overall we saw broad support for the recommendations that we have in Earth for All. Government, healthcare, workers' rights, and renewable energy have the highest support. There is a majority support among those surveyed in the G20 for reform of national and global political and economic systems because of that distrust, because of that growing social tension and people starting to wonder whether their governments are truly servicing their needs. But even policies with the lowest support are backed by over 50%. So we do know that most of the policies that we have proposed are getting support across the board. The question is, how do we translate this? How do we understand where we should go? What type of persona do citizens have? How do we understand how we properly communicate? And where should we focus our attention if we look at what we call these planetary steward segments, the unengaged or the climate skeptics? Do we focus there? Or do we focus on the concerned optimists or the steady progressives and the planetary stewards? Where should we focus our time? because we know that we've reached a social tipping point, and where more people care for and want action to protect the planet than those who do not. So 61% of all of these different types of personas want to act now. And so again, the question is, where do we focus our time? Do we focus our time on the unengaged and the climate skeptics, or do we focus our time on that 61%? Let's finish with this. 62% feel optimistic about their future, but only 44% feel the same about their country and 38% about the world. So many different data points coming from citizens across the globe. A broad support for the policies that we're bringing forward, a broad support for change, a broad support for the future and thinking about the future, and yet so much anxiety that is there as well, not knowing what the country and also the world will actually do in this very difficult time. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a difficult time. It's a complex time, and I'm hoping that the panel will unpack some of this discussion even further, because what we're seeing is that, and this is why I'd like to end with this is the decisive decade. And actually here in Europe, we know that the next von der Leyen Commission is going to be the next 5 years of this decade. We're hopeful that she will leave a legacy that is a positive legacy in the same way she tried in her last 5 years. It is important to remember, exactly as Donella Meadows, one of the authors of The Limits to Growth, said, that there is too much bad news to justify complacency, but there's too much good news to justify despair. We have made a great deal of stride in the area of shifting decarbonization, moving net zero forward. All the bad news that we hear today is trying to convince us that actually we should move backwards. And yet we know that if we look at the shift across Europe in particular, we have been able to make huge stride in moving forward. Now, how do we continue to convince the broader base of citizens and bring more citizens on an Earth for All journey? That is the key question that we're all faced with today. That is what myself and my colleagues will continue to try to work with a variety of different governments, citizen groups, industries, to move into a dimension of we can continue to shift the bar, to revamp our economies, and to actually bring an Earth for All for people, planet, and prosperity. Thank you very much.